First of all, of course, thank you to the organizers who invited me to give this talk. Thank you, and I applaud those who stayed to the last section. So thank you very much for staying around. And I owe an apology. I was not here in the morning session, so I apologize to the speakers for not being here. So I'm an historian of the modern. Hold it. Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Better?
Okay, it's better.
Better? Okay. So I'm a historian of the modern sciences of medicine, so I'm not going to show souls, and as you probably, as you can imagine, souls are not object of knowledge of the project called the modern life sciences. But I do want to show you here, or at least suggest here, that the soul was preserved in the modern life sciences, but in other terms. So I'm going to show you the different terms in which the soul was preserved, but not a soul. Is it okay? Can you hear? Okay.
Maybe you can speak.
So now can you hear me better? Hello, can you hear me better? Okay, thank you for the feedback. Okay. So, as I said, I'm not going to talk about the soul directly, but the way that the soul I'm going to suggest is preserved in modern medicine and in modern biology. And I'm going to begin with a quotation from the work of William Beaumont, from his work on Experiments and Observations, 1833, and I'm quoting. The reader will perceive some slight seeming discrepancies which he may find it difficult to reconcile. But he will recollect that the human machine is endowed with a vitality and probably produces some diversity of effects from the same causes. End quotation. And this is from 1833. During the 19th century, a new emotion emerged in Western culture. This was the laboratory emotion. It hardly existed before the 19th century. It appeared only when laboratory investigators began to encounter, invoke, and identify emotions inside their laboratories. In today's presentation, I will argue that this new emotion captured and subsumed phenomena in the modern life sciences which previously had been attributed to mystical and paraphysical forces. The new laboratory emotion was observed during moments that challenged the basic metaphor and model of the body as machine. Thus, in parallel with the mechanization of the body and of the emotions in the modern life sciences, emotion was a dimension of the body as machine which demechanized the machine. Emotion was thus and persistently a vitalistic or mystical element in a machine conception of the modern body. The conceptualization of emotion as challenging the mechanist body had a long history. And here I'm going to rely on secondary literature when I talk about the 17th and the 18th century, and then I will skip to the 20th century. So the conceptualization of emotion as challenging the mechanist body had a long history. During the 17th century, the observed irregularities in natural phenomena challenged the mechanist model of nature and of the universe. Stahl, the 17th century physician-chemist and the originator of phlogiston, had challenged iatrochemical and mechanist explanations by observing the changes in the size of his own veins as they dilate or diminish according to emotional states, end quotation. Stahl's anti-mechanist principles, which grew out of radical Protestantism, as Joanna Geyer-Cordish has argued, greatly irritated proponents of the new philosophy of Descartes and of Newtonian physics, who were determined to discover laws and pronounce both man and the universe predictable. These anti-mechanistic pronouncements of Stahl lay the foundations for the development of German vitalism. During the 18th century, The mechanisms of enlightened automata, as Simon Schaffer has argued, literally and figuratively rid the world of irregularity and switched the sources of power from invisible and capricious agents to the regular operations of predictable constructs. As Adam Smith had argued, and now I'm quoting Schaffer quoting Smith, as Adam Smith had put it in the 18th century, and I'm quoting, the lowest and most pusillanimous superstition was spawned by every object of nature whose operations are not perfectly regular, and that were therefore supposed to act by the direction of some invisible and designing power. End quotation. Modern emotion captured and subsumed these phenomena in the modern life sciences. Inexplicable deviations of the body from an ideal machine model, scientific moments which undermined the basic formalization of the body as machine, were defined as moments in which emotion had been observed. Emotion thus recuperated in a modern guise those phenomena which had been attributed to or explained by now a defunct physiology of idealistic or non-materialistic forces like spirit or soul. It represented and modeled the aberrations in a machine conception of life without appealing to these obsolete vitalistic physiologies and paraphysical forces. The machine model of the body was necessary for the scientific study of the body as an object of the life sciences, as an object of knowledge, for the modern science of labor, for the basic model of the body as a working machine, and for the model of the body as a healthy or sick machine, as normal or as pathological. In the rest of my presentation, I focus primarily on the 20th century. This was a period when emotion was already supposedly mechanized and internalized into the model of the body as machine. My major aim is to present this mystical, non-mechanical emotion which literally haunted physiologists and clinicians since it appeared suddenly from nowhere and ruined their measurements or examination. I will sample from a broad range of different life sciences arenas in order to demonstrate the wide scope of this conceptualization. One last point requires super special attention. Okay? The examples that I will discuss today with respect to emotion are not collected from laboratories and clinics that deliberately generated emotions in order to study them as objects of knowledge. They are culled from a broad community of physiologists and clinicians who did not study the emotions, but who observed, recorded, and reported unexpected materializations of an emotion during a laboratory protocol or clinical examination. These laboratory and clinical moments of emotions were not elaborated or coherent concepts or theorized entities. The individuals who reported and sometimes recorded these emotions were not investigating the emotions. They were also not studying ghosts or spirits or the soul. They studied diverse physiological and clinical phenomena, and on observing an inexplicable deviation during their experiment or clinical examination, they invoked nameable emotions like fear, anxiety, apprehension, and so forth. So you need to understand, like, something wrong is happening, something that is not expected. The animal, and it's usually working, these are animal souls, you can call them. These are physiologists, they're working with rats. And the way that I see it when I read a text, I see a footnote. Rat number 16 was excluded from the experiment because it gave something that is inexplicable, and you'll see it in the footnote because it had fear. It was apprehensive. Or a dog, they work with dogs, okay, many of these physiologists. And again, they have an aberration. I apologize for not bringing a graph. It's really like this. They have a dog, they measure its blood pressure, they're working with a lot of dogs, and then suddenly one dog, its blood pressure is behaving in an erratic way. So they say, okay, they invoke an emotion and say, oh, the dog is jealous. And then there's a small narrative Usually, how is it that the dog is jealous? They have to give an explanation, and they say, oh, the dog saw the animal keeper pat the other dog. Okay, and they say, oh, it was jealous. Now, they're not interviewing the dog, okay? They're not studying the emotions. They were studying blood pressure. They were studying a myriad of phenomena. These are not people who are studying the emotions. I want to make it clear, okay? This is very important for the argument. Okay, and now an historiographical point that I will go back to later. It is only now, okay, it is only by collecting in retrospect numerous moments of invoked emotion that we realize that they share a common feature. And I will turn back, and I will return to this point further on. The people themselves are not aware of what I'm saying. That is, as an historian, I am the one who's characterizing these moments as moments of disruption in a basic model. They will tell you, if you ask them, the dog was jealous. Okay, only by collecting a lot of these numerous invocation of emotions, as the historian, I look back and say, what is it that is common? What is it that is happening in the laboratory or the clinic that at this moment that they call an emotion? And that's the way that I'm working with these materials here. Okay, so when we read in a physiological or medical text that an animal or human had an emotion during the experimental protocol or the clinical examination, we should not necessarily expect to find a description of an emotional gesture, behavior, facial expression, locution, or vocalization. Rather, we will often find a description of an embodiment from the very gross and macroscopic to the microscopic and molecular. Okay, this is the 20th century. This observed embodiment disturbed or disrupted the experiment or clinical examination. Narratives of these sudden apparitions, and deliberately I'm using the words, of emotions, assume different forms. They were observed in the unexpected, skewed metabolic measurements of experimental subjects. They were observed in the confounding of the normal and pathological. They were observed in the failure to reach consensus among different observers. They were observed in the sporadic and capricious. During the first 4 decades of the 20th century, these emotions were observed in studying, and I'm just giving here a list, and I can go on and on, body temperature, blood pressure, red and blood cell counts, intestinal motility, thyroid functions, functions of various enzymes, etc., etc., etc. Okay, they appear all over. Okay? Otto Fallen, of the Department of Biological Chemistry at the Harvard Medical School, for example, argued during the 1910s that the discrepancies between his own measurements of human blood sugar levels and those of, I'm quoting, practically all other investigators was because other investigators, and I'm quoting, have introduced some factor which we have accidentally avoided. We believe this added factor is nothing else than the emotional state of the subject. Emotion explained, or explained away, explained why a patient had a markedly different skin temperature in the presence of Dr. A and in the presence of Dr. B, as Harold G. Wolff of Cornell University explained in resolving this inexplicable difference in skin temperature, or why, as Arthur Grollman of Johns Hopkins University observed an irregularity in his own physiology. Okay, so he's observing an irregularity. He doesn't feel anything, but he says, oh, I must be angry or something like that. Okay, he's kind of attributing an emotion. A stranger in the laboratory, the crying of a cat, the entrance of a friend, handling the switch of a treadmill, a scolding word, were invoked by numerous investigators and clinicians in explaining a variety of inexplicable disruptive embodiments during scientific protocols. These accidental occurrences were responsible for the inexplicable since they evoked a variety of emotions. That's their explanation. In the clinic, emotions confounded the basic distinctions between the normal and pathological. Or rather, confounding phenomena were defined as moments of emotion. A common platform for articulating these confounding observations was the case report or an anecdote drawn from the medical history of a patient. These reports told of repeated misinterpretations and specific of a body that confused the clinician because of emotions. And here I'm quoting from the archives a letter between Walter C. Alvarez of the Mayo Clinic and a colleague. And he's writing like this to his colleague. A man was examined by an excellent clinician here in the Mayo Clinic, and no sugar was found in his urine. It was found later at the hospital. The physician here at the Mayo Clinic doubted this and looked in vain for sugar several times. The man went to be examined for the insurance, and sugar appeared again. The reason for these confusions, inconsistencies of the body as machine, that's your expectation, and the disruption of the distinction between the normal and pathological were, as Alvarez explained, emotion. Emotion was also observed in the capricious physiology of the body, its inconsistencies. And here I'm reporting, and this is a conclusion from a major study by the Mayo Clinic on blood pressure from the 1930s, and this appears in the conclusion of this large study. And this is what they're saying. They're saying, now we see that those blood pressure estimations taken on Monday cannot be compared with those taken on Friday. This is the conclusion from this large blood pressure study. The rationale behind this iconoclastic assertion, and I'm calling it iconoclastic because what is blood pressure? They're saying every day we get a different blood pressure from the same person, okay? So you can't work that way if you have an expectation of a certain body, let's put it that way. So the rationale behind the iconoclastic assertion regarding clinical medicine was the shifting emotional state over the weekdays. And I want to remind you, this is not a study in emotions. They don't interview the people. You might say, okay, they interview the people. No, they see this phenomena of the body and they term it emotion. At times, these observations and identifications took a more reflexive turn as investigators monitored their own bodies and explained the capricious behavior of their body heat regulatory processes by appealing to emotions. In all of these attributions of emotions, the experimenter or clinician did not interview the patient or animal. More significantly, the decision to label and attribute the deviation or confusion to emotion was by exclusion. Investigators and clinicians examined and eliminated all of the possible sources for an observed unexpected deviation, and when none were found, emotion had been observed. This was the practical logic of these types of observations. This was particularly so during the 20th century, since during the 19th century, it was still possible to identify vitalistic forces or even spirits in following the same type of logic, okay, very strongly, which is exclude all possible physical causes for an observed phenomena, and you are left with a paraphysical force. Okay, that's the logic. During the 20th century, vitalistic and paraphysical forces or entities were marginalized in the life sciences, and experimenters and clinicians began to observe emotions after excluding any and all impacting substantive causes for unexpected physiological phenomena. The observation of an emotion in those embodiments that signified a deviation of the body from its expected machine-like behavior also extended to the literature that studied the body as a productive working machine. And from the 1870s, if you know the history, the worker's body becomes a focus of a lot of work, okay, from the 1870s. An illustrative example appeared in the investigations of Ugolino Mosso on muscle fatigue. In his 1908 study, Mosso observed how his body's output deviated from its standard fatigue curve. He attributed the deviation in work output to emotion. Again, I'm just giving you a lot of examples of this. Significantly, Mosso did not argue that the emotion influenced his motivation to work. Rather, emotion explained the failure and fault lines in the idealized division of scientifically managed bodies as machines. The fundamental attributes of machine-like bodies, their standardized, replicable, and predictable output, were disrupted during emotion, again, what they call emotion. This conception of emotion also explains the seemingly bizarre positioning of repetition. Like, okay, 20th century, repetition of experiments. Yeah, everything is standardized, so repetition is a basic practice in the life sciences, of course. So see what they say about repetition. And this is just one example. As H.I. Shu explained in the mid-1930s, it is known that the first metabolic test performed on a patient for diagnostic purposes are almost always too high. If the patient is examined daily, the metabolic rate will fall until a definite fixed level is reached. The cause of the fall is the emotion. In fact, some investigators explicitly argued, and this is the arguments that they make, when successive exposures of an animal to the same laboratory manipulation produced the same results, then the physiologist could conclude that he had eliminated emotion from the experiment, and vice versa, of course. Emotion as an unpredictable moment of disruption in the body as machine was also visible in terms of the structure of scientific narratives that reported emotions. In these scientific reports, emotions subverted the concrete published text. They appeared in various unpredictable places inside the published article, while other bits of information in modern science, methods, materials, results, discussion, there's a basic structure for a scientific paper in the 20th century. So while these parts appeared in formally structured and recognized places inside the published article, references to emotions as disruptions surfaced in various sections of the published text and disrupted the orderly structure of the published protocol. So when you read this, there isn't a place where they can refer to the emotion. But as I say, these articles are not on emotions. You have to read the article, and suddenly, as I said, it could be a footnote, it could be in the conclusion, it could be wherever, inside. It's not part of the formal structure of the paper. One is tempted to say that emotions haunted the text. But more seriously, when we historians are ghost hunting or emotion hunting, we must take care to read the whole text literally word by word, because as I said, it can be a footnote. Okay? Since disruptive emotions can appear anywhere inside the text itself, and as I emphasized a couple of times, emotions as disruptions appeared in numerous studies that were not about emotions. So if you just like to read abstracts, you're not going to discover emotions. Okay? The epilogue. The conceptualization of emotion that I have presented here was invisible to the investigators and clinicians who invoked emotions. It emerges only in retrospect from our own analysis of a diverse collection of different observations of intrusive, often unexpected, and unpredictable embodiments which the experimenter or clinician labeled emotion. When William James referred to, and I'm quoting from him, referred to phenomena which are incidentally reported, but which from their fugitive character admit of no deliberate control, this is him, he was referring to apparitions, haunted houses, and other such phenomena. Since observations of inexplicable physiological phenomena in modern Western laboratories and clinics were clearly not apparitions for these people, phantom ghosts, the soul, vitalistic forces, investigators conceptualize them in terms of emotion. As Susan Sontag had argued several decades ago, one of humanity's greatest fears is the fear of becoming a machine. Modern emotion, I am suggesting, is the new soul. It retains the hope of a vital or mystical, non-mechanistic, and even perhaps non-algorithmic element in us all. Thank you.